tape from the mountains of West Virginia.
Are you curious about the unknown, the unexplainable? Do you find yourself intrigued by the mysterious and paranormal side of our world? Join us on an adventure into the world of inexplicable discoveries and investigations that may someday give us a final answer as to what may be behind the veil of reality. Then it's time to turn your pods up, because we're live to tape from the mountains of West Virginia. It's time once again for Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. The universe is waiting for you.
Live to tape from the mountains of West Virginia. It's another episode of Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. Thank you for taking this journey with me on this episode of Let's Find Out. Our guest is the operations curator of the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine. She's also taken part in expeditions for Bigfoot, Dogman, and mystery cats. We will be discussing all this plus more. Please welcome to Let's Find Out Eastern Panther researcher and new friend of the show, Gene Tewksbury. Gene, my friend, welcome to Let's Find Out. We're very happy to have you on.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I really appreciate the invite.
Oh, sure thing. And when Adam talked to me about you, and then he mentions that you are a researcher for Eastern Panthers, and you really start thinking to yourself that there's a lot of sightings of things that goes on in Maine. I'll jump right down to it. Sometimes you don't really think of panthers in Maine, and that being your primary focus in your research over the years, have there been any recent sightings of an Eastern panther, or are you going from the research from sightings from years before?
My research, I've decided to keep it for the last 33 years, back to 1990. There's been a lot of stuff done that's been before that, and I feel like it's been kind of beat over and over again to the ground. So I kind of stick with stuff that's more current over the last 30 years, and try to keep it that way. There's been in 1994, 95 in Maine, there was an actual Eastern Panther sighting, and there was fur samples that were collected, and the test results came back conclusive for being a mountain lion. So I thought that was really cool. What they do say is they've had 2 confirmed sightings in the state, and they use like hair samples and tracks as like the evidence. There's a class A, class B type, decision in between, that's how they do it. Like class A is like, test proof positive of, there was a sighting, you got DNA samples from it. So, and then class B would be more the tracks and being able to prove that they are actually, Eastern Panther, mountain lion, as most people call them. But yeah.
Now, with these panthers, were these something that were brought over from another state? So let's just say, I'm going to throw a theory out there that there might have been a zoo where one of them got out. Maybe a circus was in town and something got out as well. Or are they migrating from another state?
Well, that's a good question, and that's what I try to figure out. I know that they do migrate from other states. Back in the early 2000s, there was one that was killed in Connecticut that came from the South Dakotas. When it was hit, it was 3 years old. It traveled for a year and a half from the South Dakotas into Illinois and other states. They were able to track it later on through DNA from scat and other stuff. So they do Males have a very large territory, as it is. Their territories are around 150 plus miles, that's theirs. It's, so if you come across another male, you're pushed further and further. And out west and even in central states, there are higher populations, so it's harder for them to find the territory they need, and they will migrate. And to your other questions, I don't think the circus train thing, but they could be brought in as illegal exotic pets. It's not uncommon. I know in New York State, and I believe it was during COVID in 2020, there was an 8-month-old Eastern Panther seized, or mountain lion. I'm sure it came from out west, so it probably wasn't Eastern, but it was seized from an apartment in Brooklyn, New York. So, I mean, I do know that that stuff does happen as well. The only way to find out for sure is through, if one was actually able to be captured, or we got more DNA, it would have to be tested to find out.
And unlike wolves, because wolves usually they travel in packs, but I'm not an expert on big cats, but I don't see them, at least not here in the United States. They're more of a solo creature, right? I guess once they're born, they leave and do their own thing.
Yeah, they're solitary creatures, very much so. And they do, I mean, they don't, like males. Well, like I said, they have a large territory. And if you do have, like in California, if you have like a breeding population and stuff, there could be three females within that radius of a male and stuff, and then you have when they have young, they move on and everything. But yeah, they're more solid, as soon as they get to a certain age, they're kicked out, they find their own land and kind of, live that way. They don't stick together. Like you said, they're not like a pack animal.
And being in Maine, I know there's a lot of woods in Maine and things like that. What is their main habitat? Where would they really roam around in Maine? A perfect condition for one of the large cats.
See, this is the hard part when it comes to mountain lions, cougars, catamounts, whatever you want to call them, and stuff. They are the most diverse animal out there. They can live in South America in tropical climates. They can live in forest areas. They can live in wetlands. They can live in the cold temperatures of Alberta. They have the ability to adapt to whatever environment they need or is around them.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I think that by the time you see one, it could almost be too late, because I think they're very well at hiding themselves. And I believe that there's been some reports of people winding up missing in the woods, and they attribute this to maybe they might have been taken by a mountain lion. Have you ever heard about anything like that?
No. Most of the stuff that I've heard is if somebody has seen them or come across, they run. They get out of the way. I have seen video footage from out west where females have gone after people, and it's usually because there's young. And then you do have to worry sometimes too. I mean, when it comes to these big cats, if one is weaned too soon and mom doesn't teach it how to hunt right, it will go for whatever is the easiest. And with Bruce S. Wright, the zoologist out of Canada, who did a lot of work back in the 50s and 60s on the subject and stuff. He even noted, they'll go for what's ever easier. And sometimes there was sightings back when he was writing his book of one being spotted around a school, and they did have to go get it and kind of put it down, because of the fact that, it is a threat. If it's sticking around, there's a reason why, because most of the time they're very elusive and they don't really want to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would guess that they can sense humans to be a threat. I guess most animals would, because there seems to be a history with humans hunting animals for things like that.
That's the way I see it, though, too. I get a lot of questions. Like, I have spoken with inland fisheries and wildlife with a state biologist and stuff, and they're like, they're not here. And it's like, there's too many sightings in the state to just ignore the fact that there's a possibility they're here. If animals are smart. I do think these big cats are smart. And if you're hunted to the point of extinction, you're going to learn and you're going to pass it on to the young to stay the heck away from what's been trying to kill you.
I know I would. And reading through the notes that you yourself have seen one of the, I guess it would be a mountain lion. Was it a young mountain lion?
Yeah, it was a juvenile. I actually, when I first had, because it was running beside my car, I was driving. What happened was on April 2nd of 2022, I took my daughter to work in the next town over, or 2 towns over. When I was coming back, I was probably 5 miles from home in a town called Cushing. And I come down over this very steep hill, and there's a small marsh area with a culvert. And I see something come out of the culvert, and I slowed my car down even more. And the animal started running beside my car. And I'm looking at this, and it's a very big cat, not full grown, like not mountain lion. This is a big cat that looked like a little leopard. I estimate it to be 5 or 6 months old. It was like a rusty brown with black spots on it, long, thick tail. And it ran along the side of my car, up over the hill a little ways, and then jumped into the thickets, into the woods. And I literally stopped, not thinking that mama could be close by, which was kind of stupid at the time. And I got out and I'm looking around, and I could not find the cat, after it had run into the thickets. But I was smart enough to go home and grab my gear and come back, and I was able to find a track, and I made a cast of it.
Wow. So what kind of things do you use to make a cast? And
plaster and water.
Oh yeah, okay.
There's just a little bit of a balance. And the funny thing is when I had spoken to the current state biologist, because I have talked to the retired one, I've talked to a bunch of different people, but I had actually shown him a photo of my track, and he looked at it and he was kind of like, wait a minute, this isn't symmetrical, it's asymmetrical. And he's just kind of dumbfounded when he's looking at it. And he just kept going on for a few minutes of how it just, there's no claw marks, no nothing. And he just kind of looks and he goes, where did you get this? And I told him of my sighting. And then he looked at me and he said, that means there's a breeding population, and there's no breeding population in the state. And
Wow.
That's where he left it at.
And did he wind up keeping that cast, or did you take it home with you?
Oh, no, the cast is at the museum. I just showed him the photo that I have of it. And he was actually very intrigued with it. But I did not take the cast because I was not going to hand it over to him.
No, because and a lot of the listeners know that when you wind up loaning somebody or a researcher something, most likely you're never going to get it back anywhere. During your time researching the Eastern Panthers, you also research other things as well, because you've been on expeditions for Bigfoot and Dogman in different states. Can you tell us a little bit about these expeditions?
Yeah. Actually, when I first got into this whole topic, I was like 7, and it went around Sasquatch. That was like my major thing. I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could after I read one of John Green's case books. And after I started at the museum, I was introduced to some people, and it allowed me the opportunity on my own, away from the museum, to participate in expeditions. And the first one that I did was in Whitehall, New York, with a group out of actually New Jersey, the Sussex County Bigfoot group. It was the first expedition I had ever done, and it was one of the most amazing things, because we were actually able to get like knocks and whoops and stuff on audio. And it was just fascinating to me. It was an incredible experience.
Were you able to record or videotape any of this while you were out there?
Yeah, they got audio. The group got, the Sussex County group got the audio of the whoops and the knocks.
Now, being that during this expedition, these knocks and woos were recorded, out of the other expeditions you've been on, were you successful in picking up things like that as well? Because a lot of these things it takes so long, and it's a lot of days out there in the woods. And if lightning strikes, you might be able to maybe have an experience like that.
Well, that one we had great experiences, like I said, with the whoops and the knocks. I mean, to me, that was phenomenal. The one that we did in New Jersey with the same group, we did not have any luck. There was nothing. And that's when I have people ask me about this stuff, I try to explain that 90% of the time that you're out, you're not going to get nothing. Even 95% of the time. It's just nice being out in the woods. It's nice being out. I just, to me, it's one of those mind clears. It's just so nice. But there's 5% of the time that you may, come across something. And with Whitehall, we did. The New Jersey one, no. The Massachusetts one, no. And one of the ones I did in Maine, I actually came across what appeared to be an old track. And I learned from my friends in Massachusetts that I did the expedition with, when in doubt, just cast it. It may not be nothing. It may be something. But you know what? Just cast it, because if you don't, you're going to regret it.
Now, being, in a way, you mentioned something earlier, because you started being interested in the subject around the age of 7, correct?
Yes.
Kind of close to me. It's one of those things where the library, you start looking at these books, and a lot of these books about Bigfoot and UFOs, they jumped out at me. And during that time, did you ever experience anything along those lines before you started going to these expeditions or actually really getting into the subject?
Well, when I went into the library, because like I said, I got into it at 7, and it was my mom's fault, because my mom was one of these women who loved horror movies. They all had to be, it didn't matter if it was The Exorcist or Day of the Animals or whatever. And there was really no filter for her to not have us kids watch it. If she was watching it, she was watching it. And she ended up one day watching Sasquatch, The Legend of Bigfoot. And I think she thought it was something else. And I was mesmerized by the thing. And a few years later, I was in the 4th grade. And in the library, like you said, the school library, I found the John Green case book on Bigfoot. And I was like, oh my God, I've got to read this. And I read it front to back. And I understood everything in it. The Albert Ostman story. There was stuff on Ruby Creek, everything. And I just found it so fascinating. And I remember going to my teacher and I said, oh my God, have you seen this? This is awesome. And he literally looked at me and said, I cannot believe you just wasted your time reading this crap. And I was kind of upset because back in elementary school, from the 2nd grade on, I was always pulled out of my classes to get extra help with reading because I had a trouble comprehending some of the words and being able to pronounce things. So I thought that it was so awesome that I had actually been able to read this book and understand it, the whole thing. And then for him to tell me all I did was waste my time, it was a bunch of crap, I was so disappointed.
Those were different times, but he's incorrect. It's not a time waster, because when something becomes your passion, that's definitely not wasted time, which leads up to the adulthood now with your expeditions, which brings me to the part to where, how did you wind up being the operations curator of the museum? I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Well, in 2015, we got a computer, first computer for the house, and I ended up joining Facebook, and I happened to be following the museum because my son had told me about the museum, and I thought it was kind of cool, so I started following them, and they had a Facebook post out with Captain Picard from Star Trek Next Generation going, "We want you," needing volunteers. So I ended up emailing them. I messaged them first and then I emailed them. And then a few weeks later, the woman who was the one doing the having you come in for the interviews and stuff got a hold of me. I found out that day that was Lauren Coleman's wife, Jenny, who set up an interview time for me to come in and be interviewed by herself, Mr. Coleman, the founder and director of the museum, and the assistant director at the time was Jeff Muse. And I was literally like mortified. I'm like, I can't do this. This is so intimidating, but I went in and kind of told them my story like I did with you, with how I got into it, what my teacher said. And next thing I know, I'm a Dosset there. And then about 6 months later, they hired me, which I was one of the first people they hired. And after a couple years, they were just like, we're just going to give you this title. You do this work, So I became the operations curator, and that's how it all got going.
So what's the typical day at the museum like when you're there?
Go in, make sure everything's clean and ready to go. And then when we open, you'll come into the museum. We do like that. We'll bring you in for your entrance fee. And you get an introduction on the museum, how to get around, what you're going to see. If I always ask everybody where they're from, if they have an interest. If people don't know about it, then I will go into this long introduction explaining what it is and how it started and all this other stuff. And people are kind of like, wow, it's a lot more to it than what they think. So.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much there to see, I'm sure. So what are the more, and I already kind of know the answer to this question, but what are the more popular displays at the museum?
A lot of the popular displays, the biggest one is Crookston, because we call him the selfie. I call him the selfie king. Mr. Coleman actually looked that up to find out if that was actually a term, and he found out it was, because he's an 8-foot tall Bigfoot that was made by a taxidermist in I believe it was Wisconsin. I'm not sure. Please don't quote me on that. But he was made to stand outside of a steakhouse in town. I think it's Crookston, Wisconsin. That's how he got his name. And he is everybody's favorite. We have a life-size replica of a coelacanth, which is our logo. Mothman is very, very popular at the museum. Everybody loves Mothman, and there's a lot of that stuff up in Mr. Coleman's section and stuff. It's hard to say because there's so many people that have so many different interests in the stuff. It's insane, and it's so cool to be able to meet people from all over the world. I met a Yowie researcher back in 2016, and that was one of the highlights and stuff. So.
Yeah, you don't meet many of those. I mean,
Yeah.
Because you mentioned Mothman. That's actually, because I'm here in West Virginia, and if you go a lot further south, Mothman's a big thing. Of course, Bigfoot here is a pretty big deal as well. What are the more the typical questions that the museum goers ask you? Because I know that some of them, they go in there they're already either a fan or they're curious in the subject. So what are the more common questions you get asked?
Just if there's anything local and stuff, which we do have a section that I will point out to, like when we have local people come in, we have a section for Maine. There's a Maine map with pin sightings of reported sightings that people have seen. They're color coded, whether it's Bigfoot, Dogman, mystery cats, different stuff, lake monsters, just all kinds of different stuff. And then I will actually have people ask what got me. A lot of people will ask me what got me into doing what I'm doing, and with the whole thing. And I will explain it to them like I did to you. And they're kind of like, well, that's really cool,
Is there anything new in display that's coming this year that you know of?
We just got in because the museum will be moving to Bangor, I believe, at the end of 2025, the beginning of 2026. But we got in last year at the Bangor location, a giant salamander, because there was an expedition that happened last year for I guess it's called the Trinity giant salamander. And that is now being moved down to the Portland location because the Bangor one was just a small little, what I called a cozy little nook, until the big location is open. And that's going to be one of the new displays. It'll actually be showing up at the 1st of February.
Man, I kind of want to go now. Giant salamander, that sounds pretty awesome. So what is the size of the salamander?
I honestly do not know. It's a big statue. It's pretty long. I'd say it's at least 3.5, 4 feet in length, if not longer. But it's not, I'm not like there, so I can't really tell you for sure.
Sure.
It's just huge. It's not a little tiny, 3-inch salamander. This thing's big. Okay, you've asked me a ton of questions, so I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like to know what got you interested in doing your podcast.
No, that's a great question. I appreciate you asking that. So what happened? It's a long short, but it's impossible for me to do that sometimes. Back in 2020, a friend of mine and I started doing a podcast, but it was more of a wrestling related podcast, a lot of indie wrestling. We interviewed some actors. And since we were promoting events at that time, that's when COVID hit. So we couldn't promote any events for what we were doing at the time. And so we decided, well, in order to keep ourselves busy, we started doing a podcast. And like I said, we covered pro wrestling, we covered entertainment. And then I slowly started adding some of the more paranormal things to this. And then that way to keep the show fresh. And eventually, when him and I ended the show, I started this show last year. And mostly because since I've been having a lot of experiences with paranormal since about 3 or 4 years old, it helps me to find answers for some of the life's questions that I have of why are things happening to me? Why is everywhere I go, there's always activity? And I like to ask some of the guests and experts, their opinions, and then I like to get their stories out too. So my main interest, is paranormal, cryptozoology, and UFOlogy. Just like you, it all started pretty much not only from life experience for me, but going back to the library, I found this one book which covered 3 subjects, which it had a picture of Bigfoot, it had a picture of a UFO, and I believe the Loch Ness Monster. But I want to say it was also the Bermuda Triangle. And once I read that book, it changed my life because now some things started to make a little more sense, and I've been unstoppable ever since. So that's pretty much the basics of what this show is about, is to find answers to all these questions I have. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's awesome. That is really awesome. I'm glad I asked you that.
Thank you.
That is very awesome.
And a lot of the guests, just like yourself, are great. I learn a lot from all of you, which is a little bit of the selfish part of the shows. I want to learn, but the basics of the whole show is to get this story out there from guests like you. Because when I heard about the Eastern Panther in the Maine area, instantly I was like, it's the first time I've heard this. So, I had to make the connection. Here you are. So for the listeners of Let's Find Out, what would be a great resource or books that they can read to find out more about what's going on in Maine, especially with the Eastern Panther?
That would be the book. Well, what helped me out was Bruce Esseright's book, Ghosts of North America, In Search of the Eastern Panther. And that's because it covers mainly, he was from New Brunswick, but it also laps over into Maine. There really isn't a whole lot of books on the subject for Maine itself. You can find excerpts from other books that have like newspaper articles from Maine, like Chad Armont's Furman's and things like that. But I do think that Bruce's books did a lot of justice, because there's one in the 1950s that involved inland fisheries and wildlife in Maine that shot at one. And stuff, even though they're supposed to have been extirpated in the late 1800s from the state, meaning they were here, they're no longer here until they were declared extinct until 2019. So,
wow. And for the listeners that may have questions about this subject, and not only about the Eastern Panthers, but about Bigfoot and Dogman, about the museum, what would be the best way for them to get a hold of you or anybody at the museum?
They can, if they want to get a hold of somebody at the museum, they could go to the museum website. There's an email address there for the executives that they could email. If they have any questions for me, they could reach me on Instagram or Facebook. They could private message me. I do have Messenger as well. The easiest way to do that would be through Facebook, but I'd be glad to talk to anybody if they've had a sighting, if they want more information, I'd be glad to help.
Great. And one last question. I wasn't quite done yet. Let's say, for instance, if somebody is out there in the woods in your area and they happen to see something, what's the best thing they can do not to, I say, anger one of these big cats?
Don't turn your back on it. It's the one thing that I've learned is always stay face to face with them. If you turn and you run, that just gives them the opportunity, and they're fast. But everything that I have researched and what I've looked into, the best thing you can do is face to face and try to make yourself seem bigger.
Perfect. I think that's great advice because, like I say, if you turn your back on it, it would be jumping on your back, right, and bite you in the neck.
Yeah.
That's why I don't go into the woods for anything, but not just for that, just because I'm not a woodsy kind of guy. But Dean, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for teaching me a little bit more about the Eastern Panther, especially in your area. I really didn't know so much about it until I had the conversation with you. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And then if you'd like to come back later this year, if you have any more sightings or when you go to your expeditions, if you wouldn't mind coming on the show and talking about this, it'd be great to have you back on.
Yeah, sure. I would love that.
This has been another excellent episode of Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. Please check us out on Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and all our social media pages, as well as our YouTube, and we're also on Rumble. Like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Until next time, my friends.
Thank you for listening to Let's Find Out with co-host Diego. We're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Pocket Casts, and on Anchor. For more information about Let's Find Out with co-host Diego, please visit us on Facebook.com/co-host Diego, on Twitter at co-host_Diego, and on Instagram as co-host Diego. Copyright co-host Diego. All content for Let's Find Out is the property of co-host Diego and is served directly from our servers with no modification, redirects, or rehosting. All celebrity impersonators are paid performers. The impersonated celebrities do not endorse or promote any views or opinions expressed by our guests, co-host Diego, or Let's Find Out. The information shared on Let's Find Out is provided on an as-is basis with no guarantees of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness.
Moonlight Monster Media presents Steeds Ridge DVDs, Steeds Ridge posters, stickers, Moonlight Monster Media mugs, and Moonlight Monster Media t-shirts.